Okay.
But yeah, just so that we don't sort of, how do you say?
Okay. When you get the recording finished, please send it to my daughter.
Will do. Yeah.
She's not on, okay? So, and I mean, she's happy with it, but she's not on the link, so she would like to see what it is I said. She's at the University of Toronto.
Yeah, yeah. Is it Genevieve?
Genevieve, yes.
Yeah, I really love, well, the YouTube channel and the podcast you're doing. It's absolutely fantastic. Like, I love listening to your when you're talking about the was it Foucault history of sexuality? That was so funny.
Don't get me started. I mean, I have very strong likes and dislikes, and among the things I dislike the most is celebrity philosophers.
Yeah.
Whose influence is pernicious on human life. I mean, there are such people. If you think of something like early 20th century, Sorel's book, Reflections on Violence, in which he justifies, well, mass random violence, terrorism, because he says it's the only way to get things done. Well, yeah, but we had to live through Pol Pot, right? And that makes me less enthusiastic for that idea. And given that I have more historical experience than the writers from previous generations, I can't help but apply that, because I'm basically a historian that likes to read books.
Mm.
So yeah, I'm very happy to help you out in any way that I can. If it's just this gentleman and you, that's just fine. I mean, I'll answer what questions you might happen to have.
Got some more people coming in now.
Okay.
We tend to get about maybe 5 to 15 people coming along to these sessions.
Okay, that's fine.
15, but
All good.
Nice and intimate. I prefer it that way, to be honest. Like when there's too many people chatting, it's like it's hard.
You can't have a real discussion then.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to do this, and you know, I hope that people look at the lectures that I did when I was in the 90s, when I still had everything together, and my friend Dr. Staloff, who's been added in, just to learn about the thinkers that they don't like, that they reject. That's actually what's good for them, right? Everybody should be reading, right? Not what reinforces what they already believe, because they don't need that. What they need is to understand, not agree with, but understand what alternative views are. And that's a first step in not demonizing them. In other words, the degree of political polarization we have here in America is very dangerous. The irresponsible politicians that we have are very dangerous. What you might call the decision-making class. I was a part of that. Let me be candid. We totally fucked up, right? I mean, no, the list of things we did wrong is enormously long. And we try and counterbalance that with other achievements that are relatively small in size, but get a lot of media attention. Mm-hmm. So, for example, our social structure, because of income inequality, which is rising, is now more and more approximating that of Brazil. And the problem is that's just dangerous for a ruling elite. If you want to stay in power, act like a human being, all right? What causes revolutions is not Marxist ideology. Most peasants without an education have no chance of reading Marx. What they will do is follow anyone that says, will follow anyone that says, I want to give your children an education and I want everybody to have enough food, right? It's much simpler than that. So, yeah, America's a mess right now. I follow global politics because I used to teach the history of the world as well, and I was working on one. But Europe isn't far behind, right? Or they've gotten this this ideological mind virus, and look, you're going to find it on both sides. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are responsible governors now, right? And what that's going to do is breed discontent, resentment, and also, and this is fatal, disbelief. Because if they cannot trust the mainstream media, if they cannot trust CNN or the BBC or whatever it is that they're listening to, because of its very dubious and very clear ideological bias, they're going to find alternative means of getting information. And that leads to crazy chaos. That leads to conspiracy theories and all kinds of dangerous stuff. And shot callers, let's call us the managerial 10%, the taste makers, the opinion makers, the decision makers. We blame them for not listening to us and doing what they're told. The real problem is us being so arrogant and full of hubris that we believe we can modify things so that we can improve them upward and upward until they get to be as clever as us. All right, so the arrogance of elites on both sides, and there's no shortage of that in Britain either. Yes, Brexit was probably a terrible idea. I understand the economics behind it. But with so many people pissed off and willing to vote for a thing like that, you don't blame these people who apparently don't know any better, right? You blame the people that failed to get their trust and then explain it to the point, to a point where they were saying, yes, this is best for us as a whole. All right, so we shouldn't have done that. But to go back and say, well, now let's have another vote because the sheep didn't get it right the first time, that's nothing but contempt. And that kind of arrogance is going to get people to stop listening. And when that happens again, the consequences are very dangerous. So yeah, this is not the world I had hoped to leave to my children. We have, my generation, this is the boomers, we are the most mendacious, rapacious, audacious collection of human locusts that America has seen in more than a century. The only people I can compare them to would be the robber barons of the late 19th century, right? It's all about me, you know? So instead of providing shelter and dealing with the homeless crisis, we built McMansions, giant places that we can have. About 90% of the internet economy went to the top 10% in American society. What the hell is going on? Is there nobody in charge? Is there no adult in the room? And here I'm talking about both parties. It's not a partisan thing. Both the Democrats and the Republicans spend more than they take in. It's called deficit spending when they're not faced with a war or similar calamity. And what that means is that you are going to inflate the currency. Our real rate of inflation right now is running at about 9%. This is grossly irresponsible. And we've been doing it for better than 20 years. And it's not a partisan thing. There's no real leadership and no connection to important political realities. So I'm against holding the American bottom 90% responsible because it's a way of shrugging off the responsibility that should be borne by the people that made the decisions, guys like me. So yeah, I'm a turncoat. I'm one of those renegades that said, look, we found a way to hold everybody responsible for the bad stuff in the world except ourselves. And that's actually part of the problem. I'm a meritocrat. Not that I mean, in other words, I took a test, I did real well, and I joined the meritocracy at 17, even though I didn't know one existed. I mean, that's what the test is supposed to do. And the danger here among those that go to famous institutions and get big league credentials, I guess for you folks, it'd be something like Oxbridge, is that we start to believe our own propaganda and we don't think, wow, I'm distinguished by the fact that I could solve logical puzzles as a late adolescent. We think, I'm full of moral virtue because I'm so much smarter than everybody else. This is fatal arrogance, and it really has to stop. So one of the things that I was prone to do was slap my students upside the head. In other words, show them what the limitations of their knowledge really are and give them problems that are outright insoluble, right? And then let them percolate like that. It's good for people to discover their ignorance. And too many of us have been told, well, look, we all have a common set of feelings and a common set of values, and the great unwashed in America and probably places like England or France, they deserve to have their real income decline by 40% over 30 years. What you're going to have there is people who can't pay their mortgages, who can't send their kids to decent schools. Remember, we don't have, and also we don't have healthcare. So they're going to get inferior healthcare, if anything. We're at an impasse, and I'm not optimistic about the next 30 years or so. I think that we're going to see larger scale violence. I think we're going to see military intervention by the American military, and that is intervention, no fooling around. These guys are going to come in with live fire, and both the crazy left and the flaky right are going to get hit with military force. So that's my prognostication. Yeah.
Do you mean intervention by American military on American soil against America?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In
All
other
right.
words, I think that increasingly, look what happened. Look, I mean, if you've ever been to San Francisco, it's a beautiful city. I lived there for a while and worked there.
Warriors, the basketball team there as well. So yeah.
Okay, well, there's a large cadre, 10, maybe 15% of the people that are making better than, let's say, $250,000 a year. All right, and they're just getting by because prices are so high. There's a roughly equally large number of people that are living in the street under bridges. This is unsustainable, but Americans are afflicted, and not just Americans, with short-term thinking. How do I get to the next quarter with profitably if you're a corporate exec? How do I get to the next election if you're a politician? And that problem has gone from bad to worse. They've decriminalized a lot of small time crimes like breaking into cars. So people actually leave their cars doors open, put a little sign in the windscreen that says, I don't have anything in here, you can check. So civil society is badly broken down. It is legal in San Francisco to shoot drugs, all right, in the street where people can see you. It's legal to defecate. It's legal to solicit prostitution and engage in sex acts. I mean, it's completely gotten out of hand. That's why a well-intentioned but very ineffective district attorney was just thrown out in San Francisco. The reason why is that people are not going to put up with this. The problem is, what are you going to do with these maybe 15% of the population that is indigent? Many of them are addicted to narcotics. Many of them have psychological problems. This is going to be a huge problem because it has to be dealt with. It's not an option. And not only does it have to be dealt with, but it's going to be very expensive and very difficult. It's going to involve police coercion or military coercion. And that's a shame to see. That's a failure of the decision makers, not of the people. But I could talk about philosophy if any of you are interested in that.
No, I do have a question regarding what you said earlier, and actually, I was already having this question in mind. But
Sure.
it was one thing while going through your incredible series of lectures, the very fact that they're available on YouTube for public consumption is miraculous indeed. And while I was going through that, I was thinking that, of course, you must have a certain stance towards, okay, I like these philosophers and I may not agree with these philosophers. Yet, even on careful listening, I can't really tell whether you are agreeing with someone or disagreeing with them while you're lecturing on them. How did you manage to achieve such an incredible unbiased, at least appear to be unbiased take, and how does one go about reading such material that they disagree?
Okay. All right. If you ever look me up on Substack, I have some of my writings there. And one of them is advice for teachers or teachers to be. And part of the advice, one of the things I told them is what you want to become insofar as possible is transparent. All right. We are not here to find out what you think, although that will necessarily reveal itself eventually. We are here to find out what Aristotle or Aquinas or Descartes thinks. And then after you explain to them, good morning or good afternoon, after you explain to them what it is that the philosopher thinks, then and only then can we make sense of it and can we offer reasonable criticism. And not just reasonable criticism. Sometimes I just think that the lack of moral order or the lack of a moral compass makes me hold a thinker in much less esteem, but also I find his arguments much more questionable. The best example I can give you is Heidegger. He was a Nazi. And even after the war, he didn't give that up. So there are two groups of people that really piss me off. One, we have them here more than in America or more than in England, is preachers that can't keep their dick in their pants. In other words, they're engaged in all kinds of sexual transgressions, right, while telling everybody else how to live, all right? Not only are they making a mess of their own lives, but they're making a mess of other people's lives. And they're making serious and oftentimes good ideas, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, appear as hypocritical as they are. So they have a responsibility. If you have a problem with your sex life, do not do this. There are other things you can do to earn a living, all right? I don't care about what they do with their spare time or how they get their kicks. I just don't want them to undermine one of the things that holds us together, all right? Remember, that religion comes from Latin, religio, to tie together, right? The other group that I don't like is philosophers that tell other people how to live and what's valuable in life, and then end up supporting Hitler. You owe us an explanation for that. And if, as I suspect, this is a necessary outgrowth of your philosophy, you need to explain to us how you've modified your philosophy so that it doesn't lead to genocide. I have a thing about that. My view of hatred is that if you can't think of any reason not to exterminate a group of people, then you hate them. And so that's one of the problems I have with Nietzsche. Right? He said, I think it's in the Gay Science, that in any century, there are half a dozen people that have any value at all. What that means is that everybody else in the world that lives has the moral valence of an ant, and stepping on them is not murder. So, yeah, I think that philosophy is in bad shape. The best example would be the worship of postmodernism by second and third raters now. I mean, these were smart, if messed up people, but the people that follow it now, the people that are still doing postmodernism or take seriously Foucault or Deleuze or Lacan, my view is that they don't, the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist has left them, but they're not bright enough to realize it. So something new is percolating, something new is self-assembling. And I got to admit, I have no idea what it is.
You said in the podcast you did on Foucault that postmodernism is dead, but at the same time you were saying that Foucault was the most cited person in the humanities. So
that's right.
Do you think that postmodernism is transforming into something like, well, we have things like these sort of third wave intersectional feminists that, like the scholars in the sort of in the 80s and 90s sort of took up a lot of the postmodern philosophy into their own
right. Can you name a first-rate intellect among these? Comparable. In other words, I know it's unkind, but they're derivative. They find something that they can latch onto that'll push whatever it is that makes them feel enthusiastic. And in America, that's on the right as well as the left. There's no truth, there's only my perspective. So that means that arguments are no longer about facts or about logic. They're about who you are. As a left-handed inhabitant of Indiana, I say this, and this is to be taken without criticism because you are a right-handed inhabitant of California. No, what that means is that all our arguments are ad hominem. There's no other kind of argument to make. That's what this leads to. Instead of judging an argument on the basis of what it says, and if it's true, we judge an argument on the basis of who said it. Right? There was a time when that was no argument at all. Now that's all the argument there is. So, I mean, I just shrugged this level of intellectuals off. In other words, no one will remember this or take this seriously except historians. Their contribution to real thought is nil.
Like I was talking with a professor here actually about his what he thought about postmodernism, and he was saying that he didn't how would you say, he said he didn't know where he would be without it, basically, that it was quite foundational in his worldview. And I think that was what a large part of what's happening with postmodernism and postmodernist thinking is taking over the universities. And that's the sort of second rate, if you like, where the influence is being had is in sort of career intellectuals who are sort of educating the young people, and then they're going out into the world, and that's where you see all this policy coming in.
That's exactly right. Postmodernism right now is not a question of intellectual capacity or intellectual insight. It's a question of sociology. Who's running universities? And these are the people that decide what can get thought and what can get said and what can get taught. And this practice of canceling or mobbing up people that you disagree with is a way of admitting that you don't have an argument to make. And that's an admission by the faculty administrator and administrators. And I don't hold the students responsible because they haven't been taught how to differentiate between truth and false or good and bad arguments. Instead, they've been told to react and have feelings, right? And their feelings are inviolable. In other words, no one dare question those feelings because feelings entitle them to actions that would otherwise be criminal.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm sick to death of self-esteem. I'd rather see people earn some self-esteem rather than get it as a kind of prize for showing up. And I am sick to death of authenticity. What if you're an authentic criminal? What if you're an authentic leader of genocide? I don't see any reason to believe that Pol Pot was inauthentic. I just don't know why I should care. I think we would all have been better off, and Cambodians in particular, if he had decided not to be authentic.
Yeah.
But that's not an option, because authenticity, being who you really are, is a kind of summum bonum. And what that is a great impediment to real education. Remember what I said a little earlier about the discovery of ignorance? You're never going to discover it if your feelings can substitute for that. I'd rather see people have self-respect than self-pity, but respect you have to earn, and pity you can just learn how to valorize.
So we got a question from Towie in the chat. He says, I think in your Burke lecture, you described the invention of legitimate dissent. Your opponent is not the devil. Do you think that there is any chance of that mechanism being reinstated, assuming you would agree it's completely broken down?
I think it's possible. I'm not sure that it's likely. All right. Legitimate dissent and a loyal opposition, these are incredibly sophisticated ideas, and they're also quite fragile. What it requires is mutual respect, right? And also an interested argument as it is, or rather argument in itself, rather than argument in terms of who makes it. In other words, if a very evil man, Charles Manson, tells me that 2 and 2 is 4, there's no point in saying that's a criminal giving us that idea. I don't care. 2 and 2 really is 4. So I think it's possible for us to have a domain of legitimate dissent. I don't think it's possible everywhere in the world. Currently, I don't see anything like that happening in, say, Saudi Arabia or China, or, for God help us, North Korea. But increasingly, the Western rich democracies are raising up a generation for whom freedom of speech is debatable. Oh, should we have freedom of speech or not? Well, I should have it, but no one else should. That sort of childishness should be challenged. And you're not going to learn anything from people that you already agree with. There's a saying among chess players that you only learn from the games you lose. And you really learn from the arguments you lose. And insulating yourself from losing arguments is just the assumption of omniscience. And everybody knows that's crap.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. In the spirit of what you were saying there, though, what can I learn from someone who tells me that the Earth is flat?
Okay, you can learn, first of all, that education is the most important political issue. Forget about economics and war, all right? If there's a substantial number of people who have gone through your educational system and think it's flat, then your educational system is a mess. That's number one. So we want to go back and look at how our society is run. Don't just blame the fools that think that. Ask how their teachers allowed this. Are there teachers or administrators that think the earth is flat? God help us, then we're in real trouble. So you can learn from people who think the earth is flat. You can learn from people who deny your fundamental assumptions about the world. So if you have somebody that thinks the world is flat, and actually if you go on YouTube, you can find some. I mean, one of the things about YouTube is that no matter what you're looking for, there's some of it there. The flat earthers, don't know how science works. Again, what kind of education did they get? The country is culpable for allowing that. We get the same sort of thing with new early Earth creationists. We have people who deny Darwin. Again, this is a failure of education, right? Nobody should be able to get out of 6th grade thinking stuff like that. And that's the point at which minds are much more malleable, right? So you can learn from people who think that the earth is flat, from people who think that genocide is good. You can learn from people who think all kinds of bizarre stuff. Look, I was a teacher for 40 years, and some of the most worrisome and, for me, illuminating things were when students start spouting some absolute crazy stuff that I had never heard before. And that makes me stop and think, well, okay, well, how did you get into this mess? And what, if anything, can I do to untangle that? And that makes you rethink what your own thinking is. How can I get from knowing what the right answer is to transferring that right answer to this person? It involves a whole bunch of preparation, like explaining to them how science works and explaining to them that science is fallible. And when it finds out that it's overgeneralized or generalized poorly, they modify their generalizations. Science is supposed to be like that. So the fact that scientists get things wrong sometimes, that's not an argument against science. That's an argument for it, right? But they haven't seen it that way. Yeah, go ahead.
With respect to the previous question that was asked by Kavi, and it was that you said reinstating something like reinstating legitimate dissent and actually allowing for conversation and learning to happen rather than just being echo chambers. It requires a great deal of sophistication. But as you said, there's also this in your rhetoric earlier, you talked about the arrogance of elites that run the world all over, and it seems that it's only the elites who get to keep running the world because they're in these closed systems of chains, and nepotism of some kind is the only thing that benefits them. So the next person who's going to be in charge of some aspect of the country would come from this circle of elites as well. How can we have? But at the same time, it requires a certain degree of elitism or sophistication in order to bring about the kind of change that would be perceived as ideal as well. So how do you keep an anti-elite rhetoric as well as look for a sophisticated solution at the same time? What would be the right balance there?
It's a great question. Okay. The bad news is that every government that currently exists, no matter what they claim their ideology is run by an elite.
Yeah.
That's just the way human societies work. In other words, we can't, it just doesn't work to get 330 million Americans together to vote in a democratic fashion. What do you think of this? What do you think of this? Most of them don't think anything about it. They're thinking about their job. They're thinking about their lunch. They're thinking about their girlfriend. They're thinking about something else. Only a small number of people devote their lives to politics, thank God. What we do need to do is to have a sense that I might be wrong. To accept, in other words, the discovery of ignorance is crucial here. I have been wrong in the past and I might be wrong now. You young fellows look like you're probably in your 20s. Let me break this to you. 10, 15 years from now, when you're in your 30s and 40s, what you're going to find is that you don't believe everything then that you did now, which is a good reason for you to chill out, not for you to abandon your beliefs, but to have a certain wholesome humility, right? So let me give you an example from American history. In the election of 1800, which is one of the great achievements of the Enlightenment, I think it's far more advantageous than the terror of the French Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, who was opposed to the ruling Federalists, wins the election. And Federalists are in a dither because they think this is the end of the world, because they think that he's a dangerous, bad Jacobin, and he will ruin America, and the end of the world is nigh. The most responsible elements in the Federalist Party said no. All right, we signed on to agree that we would respect elections, which is why one of the reasons why Mr. Trump is so dangerous. And they respected the outcome of the election, although they felt that this was catastrophic. Now, it turned out that America didn't collapse and the world didn't end by this peaceful transfer of power. That peaceful transfer of power among people who have profound differences and a considerable amount of distrust and disdain was one of the great achievements of the Enlightenment. That's the way power, I'd like to see power transferred rather than the guillotine. Now, we've done it once. We haven't been perfect at it. If you look at the election of 1860, there we get an unwillingness to trust the other, so we get a civil war. But we have to be willing to accept the fact that we may be wrong and our neighbor with whom we disagree with may be right. And if that's the case, then you have at least the chance of peaceful civil discourse, which doesn't implicitly threaten to bring the gun and the bomb into American politics or into English politics, right? My point is, we are too arrogant and we are too sure of all the things that we believe. And if other people believe differently, we don't accept that as actually normal and natural in any free country. Instead, we treat it as some sort of intellectual leprosy, and we do our best to exterminate it. That's the beginning of the end. We have to stop telling people that they're always right and that you always have something important to contribute, and that your self-esteem is the most important thing. Self-esteem needs to be earned, not given. And that will give people self-respect rather than self-pity. And self-respect requires that you acknowledge that you're intellectually limited like everybody else.
But before we come on to the question from Tawi in the chat, I just wanted to ask about, we spoke to Sheldon Solomon a few weeks ago. He's the inventor of, do you know terror management theory? It's a
Of what?
Terror management theory. It's a theory in psychology.
Okay.
It's connected with this idea of self-esteem that's sort of rampant. Yeah. What Sheldon's idea is that self-esteem within a worldview that sort of offers some comfort about death anxiety. So if you cling to sort of like a national identity or something that's going to be there when you're no longer here, that sort of the reminders about death anxiety ramp up this sort of drive towards things that give you more self-esteem, or there's various different effects of it. I was wondering, because you connected in your lecture about Heidegger, the second part of his book, to Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death.
Yeah.
that book is basically what Sheldon's work is based on. I was wondering, just so that I can, talk.
Sure.
Like, what
I've had metastatic cancer for the last 11 years. So I am very much conscious of my own mortality. And every day is another bit of sand through the hourglass. So I understand what anxiety is, and you can use it constructively or destructively. But the most important thing to do is not to use it for make-believe constructions, right? Not everyone is good, and not everyone merits self-esteem. I don't think Charles Manson should have a great deal, should have self-esteem at all. He's a wretch. You know who that was before your time, but he was a mass murderer.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Or
Actually, Sharon Tate, that's the one, correct?
yes, that's the one. Yeah. Okay. So how about we look? Oh, and another dangerous thing is the fact that it's infected politics. I don't know if you're aware, but you can look it up on Google. There was, and perhaps still is, a California State Board of Self-Esteem, whose job is to make sure that all Californians have self-esteem. I mean, I think when everyone has self-esteem, nobody has self-esteem, because not everyone's conduct is estimable, right? If you're a child murderer or if you're a wife beater, I don't want you to say, I'm really proud of this. I want you to say, my life is messed up and my conduct is unacceptable, and telling me that I should just be me, my authentic self, is a lapse in moral judgment. Yeah.
It's a curious thing though, because at the same time, people who have their life together don't tend to turn into child murderers.
That's good, yeah.
So it's a kind of a chicken and the egg thing. Are we telling child murderers to have self-esteem, or are we telling people to have self-esteem so they don't become child murderers?
Okay. My sense is that people do not decide to murder children because they don't value themselves enough. I think they do it out of homicidal rage that probably has some sexual twinge to it. And I think that encouraging every possible emotion and every libidinous desire is a mistake, right? What we need is a goalie in front of the net saying, I'm sorry, if you think that killing your neighbors or genocide against another religious or ethnic group is a good thing, you don't get to have self-esteem, you don't get validated, and people don't pat you on the back. You can't appeal to the government board for self-esteem saying, I'm lacking in self-esteem because I want to kill everybody that's left-handed. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Do you feel like then there's some parallel in that sense of you don't deserve self-esteem? There's a parallel between that and cancel culture, where if you present either politically incorrect or progressively or regressive ideas, then you don't deserve to have a platform.
Okay, here's the difference, right? If universities are not places where you can speak freely, where can you, right? So if someone wants to say, I think genocide's a good thing, and there's somebody on campus that wants to sponsor that, I say, let him in, because iron sharpens iron. If you have good reason to believe that genocide is an evil, show up, ask a question. Don't shout him down, because shouting someone down or refusing someone a platform does not make evil ideas go away. It drives them underground, and it gets them a sympathy that they do not deserve, because they can represent themselves as being oppressed. So I'm okay with real Nazis and real fascists and real Stalinists and real Maoists to be allowed to speak on campus. I don't care what they believe, and I don't care how people's feelings are. It's more because universities are not here primarily to develop your feelings. They're here to primarily develop your intellect. And you'll develop your intellect, first of all, by realizing how big human nature really is and how far your local echo chamber is from representing the entire understanding what people believe, and you also have to learn how to handle yourself. You have to learn how to handle ideas that you find repellent or repugnant. You don't do that by acting like a 2-year-old throwing a tantrum. You do that by acting like a 22-year-old and asking a lethal question. So in other words, for someone that likes genocide, so you like the idea of the Holocaust, and you like the idea of, say, the extermination of the American Indian, and you're like, I mean, look, England has had plenty of genocide. One of the most important books lately written is by a guy named David Reich. He runs the historical genetics lab at Harvard Medical School. So this is real legit stuff. In other words, it's about ancient DNA that they can get out of bones. And although it can't tell us everything, what it tells us is dispositive. I mean, there's no wiggle room here. Well, it turns out, and this is something to think about, and it's actually might inform your discussions of politics in England. You know, Stonehenge, right? The big set of monuments, and it's an ancient Druid cult center, apparently. Okay, they have sequenced the DNA that they got out of those graves, so they know who they were. You're also familiar with 1066, the Norman invasion. You heard of it? Good. All right, enough history is being taught here. There is no genetic connection between the people that built Stonehenge and the people who lost the battle to William the Conqueror. In other words, in the intervening 3,500 years, the entire population of England had been wiped out. If they had been kept as slaves, or if there had been intermixing of the genetic pools, that would show up in the bones. So you're standing right, on land that was subject to genocide, and then subject not quite to genocide, but pretty close to it, when the Normans rampaged through the country. And I guess during the English Civil War, the Puritan Revolution, you had genocide, but that was probably restricted by religion rather than phenotype. And Ireland has gone through much the same process. Yeah. So one of the things we learn from history is that genocide is terrifyingly common. It's not unusual. You've heard, no doubt, about the European or white settler destruction of the American Indians. The largest known massacre of American Indians happened in 1350 AD in South Dakota. South Dakota is roughly the geographic center of North America. All right, and this was done by stone tools. It was one tribe on another. It's larger than the 2 largest European Indian massacres. So people have been doing this for a long time. And genocide is the ultimate result of refusing to acknowledge that there may be other legitimate ways of viewing the world besides your own, right? A personal note, when I was a graduate student, I was teaching at City College of New York, and the chairman of the department was named Rada Milantevich, and she was a real, what we would call woke nowadays, radical lesbian. And she was interested in using history as a kind of politics. She knew that many of the historical claims that were being made in this class were lies, because that's what the textbook said. And when I asked her about that, she said, look, don't be stupid. There's no true, there's no false. Our discussions of things like history are political weapons, and the only question is what side you're on. Now, here's the kicker. About 10 years later, I saw her on TV. By this time, I had gotten my degree. I was teaching at Princeton. And it turns out that she had taken an early retirement so she could go back to her native Balkans and participate in politics. Our sensitive left-wing professor was now the Serbian Minister of Information under Milosevic. So she was explaining to people how the big piles of corpses and the mass rapes and the mass summary executions, why they didn't happen, and if they did happen, they were okay. So she swung from far left to far right with surprising ease. And that's the worry that I have. All right. I don't think that there's much distance between the genocidal left and the genocidal right. It all begins with denying that anything is really true or false. And that means even if you have big piles of corpses, you can get on television and say, there's no such thing. And besides, you're interfering with our internal affairs. And, you know, the whole collection of rant and cant that you get from politicians, particularly from the ones that are given the job of Minister of Information. So, yeah, I've had, I mean, I see her as being a war criminal. I don't think she was ever indicted. But the danger of radical political positions is that it tends to make you first reject all alternative ways of thinking, and then with it reject the people that are doing the thinking. And once they become outside of the human domain, well, then it's like stepping on ants, or maybe even better, stepping on dangerous animals, dangerous bugs that deserve to be killed. Right? So yeah, I think that the danger with what far left agitation is that when it comes into power, it turns into far right genocide. And then I don't know whose side to be on, except that I hate this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, we just want to ask the question in the chat. Tawi asks, it sounded earlier like you were warning against the belief that a strong intellect is the highest virtue. Is this connected with the warning from Kierkegaard against worshipping rationality as an idol? And then side, he's 36 and can verify that he believes a lot of things differently than he did in his 20s. So
okay, that's a really good question too. I don't think a strong intellect is the highest moral virtue, right? Here's the deal, and this is actually the last chapter in that world history I was writing in. Maybe I'll go back to it. The reason why I'm a Christian is because it's not clear to me that love is a lesser value than truth. I like them both. The danger is, in a Venn diagram, they don't perfectly overlap. We get this reason as the supreme value coming from the Greco-Roman tradition. But if you look at something like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, there's simply no mention of altruism because he doesn't see it as a virtue, because he can't see what the rational point is of doing something for other people. What do you care? You don't feel their pain or pleasure. I mean, if you want people to applaud you, maybe you do it then, but you always do it because you're egoistic in your ethics. Jesus says, the Good Samaritan, the guy that helped out someone for no advantage at all, that's actually something that we can introduce that will modify the egoism of rationality. So I don't think a great Plato, and I love him, but I also get angry with him sometimes. He thought that a superior intellect was the greatest virtue, and I'm not convinced. I can think of many evildoers who had very high IQs. I also I read a book, I forget the name of it, but it turns out that among people in Europe during the Nazi occupation that hid Jews, hiding Jews at your own risk, it correlates inversely with the number of university degrees you have. So the better your intellect and the more sharp it's been made, the less you are inclined to offer common decency and common righteousness to people that when it doesn't advantage you. So here's the point. The most difficult single problem that our species faces is the disjunction between love and reason. And what I find very difficult is that I don't see any way to make them completely overlap in that Venn diagram. So sometimes you're going to be forced to choose between what makes sense and what is benevolent. My point is this, maybe making sense isn't everything. Yeah. I mean, object to this, push back on this. I mean, if you see what I'm saying, go ahead.
I very much agree with you on that. So I feel it's more to do with I think people value intellect. Into my mind, I feel people value intellect more than people value benevolence or altruism in a certain way, because the idea of religion or something that transcends the self kind of is no longer the center place of anybody's belief systems or everyday activities. And so therefore people who have a good understanding of religion, or perhaps a good understanding of spirituality, or some kind of thing that transcends just themselves, that they care about, are more prone to appreciate altruism or acts of kindness or love more than intellect. So because people who have to value intellect also value their own intellect, or maybe value or aspire to somebody else's intellect, and so they value so most of their approach towards fulfillment looks inwards towards themselves, whereas people who value love or kindness, their fulfillment looks outwards at others, and kind of sees the whole world. So I believe that strongly. So I don't feel there's a pushback from me. However, I do want to go back to the previous kind of discussion we had before Tanvi's question. There was regarding war and stuff. I mean, just touched upon it. I was thinking about it in the recent kind of the Ukrainian-Russian war that's going on as well. Is that as comparing this to what I thought people might have felt earlier time, maybe the 50, 60 years ago, when other world wars were happening, or wars even in Vietnam was happening, there was still a groundswell of support about halfway across the globe in other places to kind of intervene in these wars among people. Now you can say this groundswell of support was inherently wrong, or perhaps it was in the Vietnam War to send barely like 18-year-old adults to their deaths was horrifyingly bad, and I do agree with that sentiment. But there was also this generalized feeling that a lot of people could drum up support for it, or could drum up a sympathy for it in one way or the other towards somebody else halfway across. While I'm looking at my own stance and the stance of people around me during the Russia-Ukrainian war, it took absolutely very little time for me to move on from it. In no time at all. For a week I was aghast, and I was like, oh my goodness, can't believe he's doing that. And 2 weeks later, I was like, oh, did you hear what happened in the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial? And and I was thinking about my own stance, and I was really worried about why I'm not able to feel as intensely and consistently about an actual war and loss of life that's happening, not 2,000 miles away from right where I'm sitting right now. But also, it's is it what's happening to society as a whole that's happening, and how is this not a sign that society is more fragile than it is now, and there's less cause for optimism for strong societies than any time in recent history.
Okay, I mean that's a couple of very complicated questions. Let me talk about your last one first. Put it back there. I was struck by the fact that you phrased your disgust at the Russian invasion of the Ukraine in terms of your feelings. I was aghast. I didn't like it, but my feelings became numb over time. This is called, I think, compassion fatigue. What if, and this would be a way to try and square the circle, what if our moral judgments about aggressive war, I mean, in other words, non-defensive war, what if they aren't properly situated among our feelings, but within our knowledge as an understanding of our moral duties to other people?
Okay.
Right. And we have universal moral duties to everybody. And while your feelings about it may get fatigued, oh, I'm tired of doing this, the better part of your intellect might reinforce your feelings and saying, look, I don't care how I feel about this. I care about doing the right thing. I'm currently giving a series of benefit lectures for the Ukrainian relief. And look, I'm pretty sick because cancer meds are almost as bad as the disease. And I do it, and I just drag my ass in front of a camera because there are people that deserve it, and I have moral obligations to them. I'm not doing it because I enjoy it. I'm not doing it because I want people to say, oh, you're a wonderfully compassionate guy. I'm doing it because I feel an obligation, I know I have an obligation to do it. And I'm stepping up and accepting the fact that I have moral duties that may well not be enjoyable, and you're obligated to do them anyway. That's the Stoic and Kantian in me. Now, to go back to your first question, which is a real can of worms too. I think that religion is misunderstood. in the following sense. I don't treat religion as a set of propositions which are true and false. Instead, a religion is a language. It gives you not a vocabulary. It gives you a vocabulary, but not in the sense of a collection of words. It gives you a collection of images or symbols. Cain and Abel, David and Goliath, the Good Samaritan. And there's also a grammar. In other words, rules for the deployment of these symbols. Now, here's the kicker. There's no such thing as a true and false language. That's a category mistake. There are true and false sentences. So I don't care what language somebody's speaking when they talk about our ultimate moral responsibilities. What I care about is what they're saying. So that's why why I like Buddhists and Muslims and Jews and Zoroastrians and anybody, and for that matter, Platonists, because I see that as a monotheism too. My point is then, if you don't have some sort of religious language, then you're not able to articulate the reason why we shouldn't countenance genocide. What if genocide is serves our self-interest, as it does for somebody some of the time? Well, rationally, I don't know what reason you should give up. You should then refrain from genocide, but I think it's an abomination anyway. Let me give you the most terrifying of examples. Hiroshima. I don't think that there's any good logical reason not to nuke Hiroshima. It's not that I'm advocating nuking Hiroshima or anyplace else. It's not unreasonable. It's an abomination. And here, I'd love to trump reason, because making sense isn't everything. And so my argument would be then that it's important to have at least one religion, because that gives you a way of communicating your deepest moral commitments about how the world should be. It is even better if you know more than one. I'm a Christian because that's my first language. I was raised on it as a kid, but I have a near native fluency in Platonism. I mean, you wouldn't know I wasn't a Platonist if you were to try and figure it out. I've tried to get bits and pieces of all the other great religious traditions because they all have something to say to you. I mean, you can't know a priori that they're not going to inform you of something worth knowing. And yes, it's not going to be a series of verifiable propositions, but science isn't everything. I like science and have the greatest respect for it, but I'm not sure that it's going to solve all human problems.
Far from it, it's more as well.
Right. So if you see what I'm saying, I'm not dogmatic about religion. I don't care whether Jesus rose or lived or any of that stuff. What I care about is that it gives people a way of saying we ought not to nuke other people. Right. And people will say, well, look, we can save our own soldiers and we can end the war in a quicker period and all the rest. I say, all that's true, but it's an abomination and should not be done. One of the great things that turned my thinking around on this is that Dwight Eisenhower, when he heard about the existence of the atomic bomb and that they intended to use it on Japan, he went ballistic, which is a funny way of phrasing it, but it's true, and insisted that they not do that. He said, number one, I don't want to open the door to the use of a weapon like that that destroys whole cities at a time. Number two, it's immoral, it's wrong. If you're willing to be a little patient, you can blockade Japan. It can't feed itself. It has no energy sources. And if you keep on bombing areas that have military significance, you'll be able to force them to surrender. There's no need to wipe out hundreds of thousands of people at a shot. And I thought that was very important because it's easy to make moral judgments in hindsight about people you don't know. But he was on the ground, he was a general, he knew what was at stake, and he said, absolutely not, right? So a final thing to think about. The two easiest jobs in the world are spending other people's money and improving other people's morals. That's something to consider.
I should charge for this.
No, I mean, A real teacher teaches you for your benefit, not for his.
Mhm.
So we've got a few questions, if you have time for them.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one question was from somebody who couldn't come today. He asks, and it's quite linked to what we were just talking about. He asked, what was the most important lesson you learned from the Bible?
Oh, the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you had told that to the Greeks, they would have looked and said, well, the first two guys that passed by, that makes sense. This costs him 2 silver coins to help somebody that he's probably never going to see again and does him no good. Why would you do that? And the problem is, of course, it doesn't make any sense. It's not rational. Self-interest might well be rational, but as Adam Smith himself says in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, market self-interest and rationality needs to be balanced with a sense of sympathy, of love for other people. And that's actually why Adam Smith is generally misunderstood, because people will only read his economic writings, the Wealth of Nations, but they don't want to read enough so that they understand that this guy has a set of assumptions about the human psyche, which would make self-interest in capitalism mitigated by what you might call Christian religious impulses. And here I'm not talking about dogmas about rising from the dead and stuff like that. I mean the Good Samaritan. There's nothing in the Greeks or the Romans, and take it from me, I've read them. There's nothing comparable to the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's the reason why I really like Buddha too.
So the last question we have from Tawi is maybe the most common objection to what you were saying about religion is that religion has still led people to commit the worst acts imaginable through history. Perhaps these cases are even worse since those committed them believed deeply in the righteousness of what they were doing.
Okay, I would push back on that. I don't think that the Mongol control of Central Asia was driven by their sun worship. Yeah. I think it was driven by the fact that they had massive cavalry armies that nothing could withstand. I don't think that the genocide of the inhabitants of the Americas was driven by Jesus so much it was driven by avarice.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's just me. I'm a little cynical in that respect. It's not that religious people haven't done evil. The point is that everybody's done evil, whether they're religious or not.
And most people
religion
most of the time. So because then there must be somebody who rationalized it under religion instead of something else.
I'm sure that they could. That's why religion is one of those common properties, and co-religionists have an obligation to go back among their own because they have credibility there and say, this is wrong and I will not put up with this. A good example would be the sectarian religious conflict in Northern Ireland. Once we get an agreement, the best men or the best women in each community should not go to the opposite community. They should go back to their own and say, so help me God, you will not break this truce. You will not inflict this on my children. And if you do, you will not have to worry about them. You'll have to worry about me.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, I have a friend who's a Jewish doctor, and he goes back to the Jewish community and says, look, we're not putting up with this. I do that with the Catholic community. I say, look, there's a long tradition of anti-Semitism. Bring it, I will crush you. And I have. Another thing that is unacceptable is pedophilia. I'm tired of having this swept under the rug. I'm tired of hearing lies and excuses. So what I propose is that everyone not give any money to the church. And here I'm talking about the people that actually go. Don't give them a nickel until they actually do this, because they will take money seriously. Mm-hmm. So being a member of a religious community can allow you to steer it ever so slightly away from what's evil and towards what's good. Right? And if you try and do that as an outsider of that religious community, people are not going to take you seriously because you lack credibility. Right? So, yeah, we all start with our own families and our own communities, but our moral obligations are like a bullseye, concentric rings. And Jesus was thoughtful enough to extend them to people on the other side of the world that we don't know and will never know, which means everybody counts now. There is no other anymore. And all I ask you to do, for those of you who don't like Christianity, stop and look at the world around you and ask what happens when we no longer tell the story of the Good Samaritan. We teach 5-year-olds the difference between right and wrong using that. We don't have to give them complicated philosophical stuff. You just say, what do you think about the man who helped the man that was all beaten up? Was that a good thing or not? Do you think we should take care of people that get hurt? And that is the beginning of sanity and grace.
One of the other things I really love about the Good Samaritan story is that there was no chance that the Samaritan would have been a Christian or a Jew. It's just some guy like who's
Worse than that. It's not, it's not a Christian or a Jew. He's a Samaritan. Let me explain to you what a Samaritan is. Samaritans are the people that were originally Jews that were swallowed up in the Assyrian invasion of 786 BC. And that's when they lost the 10 lost tribes of Israel. These people gave up on their own monotheistic religious tradition. They intermarried and had religious and had cultural syncretism with the local non-Jews. And so by the time Jesus is around giving this parable, they are regarded as ritually unclean, like pigs or shellfish. You can't have dinner with them. You can't touch them because they're unclean. Jesus says the first guy that walked by was a priest, and the second guy was some other religious figure, and they're Jews in good standing. The Samaritan is outside this, and we look down upon him, we disdain him, but he's the one that's genuinely godly. So it's not just some random person. This is somebody that's actually walked away from ritual and from tradition, but still has the fire of love burning.
I always think that's a really important sort of detail that people leave out of the story, is that the Samaritan is someone that you don't like.
Right. In other words, this is someone, I don't know, what would it be like the Dalits in the caste system? You can't come near them. They're unclean. But perhaps it turns out in reality that they understand the difference between right and wrong. And that means our ritual observances are a hindrance to religion, not a help.
Yeah, the Dalits problem was a huge thing. Even it still goes on to me. I'm from India. So
right. Look, it still goes on everywhere. It's like fingers on the same hand. It can be about religion. It can be about race. It can be about ethnicity. It can be about class. And the only universal set of moral rules that take into consideration the value and dignity of every person, they all turn out to be religions. It doesn't mean that's all religion does. It does lots of bad stuff, but it's our only chance of finding our way through this labyrinth. If you want to find someone that I think is a great Hebrew prophet of the 20th century, since you're musicians, you probably know, who am I thinking of? The Canadian musician, Cohen. What's his first name?
Leonard Cohen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He's a prophet. All right. He makes constant reference to Hebrew scripture, but he also understands Christianity and respects what's good in it. And I think that's the smart thing anywhere. Right. It's not accidental that he makes general moral arguments about the direction and fate of the world, where most popular music is talking about sex and anger.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on like these sort of objections people have to religion, the sort of resistance people have. I think to try and understand that is also quite important. I think like if you read some of the things in the Old Testament that are very objectionable, like for example Elijah and the prophets of Baal, you know, where he's sort of like, you know, big dick energy, sort of like saying, hey, this is my God, check it out, and then he kills them all. And yeah, so and people like I know I watched I come from a Protestant background, and I've sat through exhortations where people praise the guy, and you can understand why people have an objection to that. And
absolutely right. In other words, there is no scripture that is free from evil. There is no religious tradition that is free from evil. There is also no non-scriptural book that is free from evil, and there's nobody on the planet that's free from evil. So accepting that the fact that we're all flawed and that we're not perfect, nor are we perfectible, which is the seduction of Athens, right? Plato thinks people are perfectible. To say that there's always a fly in the ointment is a very wise idea. And to be picking up on that, very smart. Now, here's how I would try and explain that in world historical terms. Okay, if you look at the earlier books of the Old Testament first, right? We get the Pentateuch, and then the next one is Joshua. And Joshua is the one who actually leads the chosen people into the promised land, and God tells him that you're supposed to kill everything you see there. So when they march around Jericho and allegedly the walls fall down on their own, not so much. Instead, they destroyed those walls and then killed everybody in the city. And then they killed all their livestock, and then they destroyed, they made it into rubble. So yeah, there are genocidal passages in the Old Testament, all right? But there's a change. Here's the deal. In the 6th century, the remaining 2 tribes of Israel, right, because there are only 2 left because the Assyrians created Samaritans a couple of centuries before. They get overwhelmed by the Babylonians, and they're taken to Mesopotamia and enslaved. Okay, and they're kept there for about 100 years, maybe a little more, because they were let out in groups. And the reason why they were freed is because the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians. So the Jews saw the invading Persians as the hand of God. Now, they were forced to live among the Persians until the Persians began letting them go back to their homeland to rebuild their sacred city in groups, in tranches. Okay, here's the big deal. I had never noticed this before, but it's the prophets that are writing just before, during the Babylonian exile, and also just after. It's just after when they go back and rebuild the Second Temple that the Old Testament goes from being an oral tradition to being a written down tradition, right? And so they have to splice together all these stories, and that accounts for some of the anomalies in it. But here's the big deal. If you look at something like Isaiah, and Isaiah is written probably during the exile, all of a sudden, Yahweh doesn't want everybody but the chosen people to prosper and do well. There's a line in it which says, I really love, something to the effect that I really love the Jews, my chosen people, and I really love the Assyrians, the work of my hand, and I really love the Egyptians who spring from my other hand, or something like that. In other words, Yahweh now has moved from being a tribal God to being a universal God. And I spent a long time. In other words, I brood about books and have all my life. And I was trying to figure out how they did that. And then, last couple of years, it occurred to me. The Jews thought they were the only monotheists in the world, and everybody else was a polytheist. But the Persians that liberated them by conquering the Babylonians were Zoroastrians. They were monotheists from a different tradition. This must have blown the Jewish intellectual leaders and leaders in general away. We thought we were the only monotheists in the world, and now a giant empire that's organized, whose central religion is monotheism, has shown up. So we're not the only monotheists. So God must really like the Persians. But once he starts liking people that aren't chosen, and once he favors people that are monotheistic, the possibility emerges that what used to be local tribal rules become universalized moral norms.
Okay.
Right? So I think that there's a change in the Old Testament from the primitive tribal God, right, who's essentially a volcano god, right? He's pissed off, to a kind of universal ground for universal moral obligations. And so it turns out then that everybody's the chosen people. And this is setting the stage for what will come in the New Testament with explicitly universal moral norms. So it's not that these explicitly universal moral norms don't exist in the Old Testament, they do, but they develop over time. And here's why. God reveals himself, but only in stages. If you look at that and actually read the Bible, what you'll see is he reveals parts of himself, and then he tells the people to whom he's given this moral law to behave well, and then they don't, because that's how people are, and then they get punished for it, and then they repent, and then God says, okay, I'll give you a break again. Let me reveal a little bit more of myself, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. And so God never lies about his properties, but he does withhold information that might correct mistakes that those who get the revelation make. Let me just give you an example. The first commandment, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me. Now, you'll notice there in England and here in the US, it is illegal to own heroin, it's illegal to own cocaine, but it's not illegal to own magic fairy dust, because magic fairy dust isn't real. You only prohibit real things. So in the first commandment, when God prohibits them from having other gods, that assumes that other gods are real.
Yeah.
Now, the people he's talking to believe that, but one assumes that Yahweh does not. It's not that he's lying by saying that they're real. He says you can't have any other gods, because the people that are getting this information believe in other gods, and that's what makes them so tempting. So my point is this: later on, by the time we get to the post-exile or Babylonian exile, we're going to get the idea of one God being universal, and that doesn't get revealed immediately. So my point is that the first commandment is not monotheistic, it's monolatrous. It doesn't say there aren't other gods, it says you can't worship them. Later on, Yahweh's going to let them know this. By the way, there's no other God to worship, so the whole idea was stupid. I was just taking my time explaining.
Yeah.
So again, read carefully and with some degree of sympathy and curiosity, you'll get a lot more out of the text.
Yeah, please do let us know when you.
Yeah, I'm kind of fading now. I have a Q&A to do this afternoon for the for the Ukrainian relief, but I'll take one more question. So make it hard.
I mean, I have another one. Just on this topic, I do have a feeling that there's a sort of leftover evil that's not dealt with in the scripture. And you find it in Revelation, where there's a sort of feeling, instead of like a resolution where everything's sort of light and happy, there's a absolute sort of wrathful side of God that you see there. You can see it in like the second chapter of Revelation, where Christ says, I've given the harlot Jezebel time to repent of her immorality, but she's unwilling, so I'll strike her children dead. There's a sort of like there's a darkness there that I don't see resolved necessarily through Christ's sacrifice. Like, what would you say?
I have no idea whether it has anything to do with Christ's sacrifice. It's one of the weirdest books of the Bible. Okay, you get the lamb and the bowls and the seals and the trumpets, and it's like a bad acid trip. Okay, the way I handle Revelation, because I make very little sense out of it, is to argue that this is a macrocosmic representation of a microcosmic experience. In other words, it's the end of the world. And what happens is, when you change your religious orientation from the absence of religion to the presence of it, the end of the world happens every day when people do that. And what this is I treat it as an allegory of human psychology. And believe me, when you finally break through and see religious stuff as being serious, that is Armageddon, because it totally messes up your brain and it makes you reevaluate all your other thinking. I mean, I used to think that, as somebody suggested, reason was everything and a big brain was everything. No, it's not. Second to that, this book is extremely important because it introduces to not just the Western world, but to the world, a new conception of time. And that means a new conception of history. Every place in the world, in the archaic world, views history as being circular. It's a cycle. Think of the cycle of the seasons. Think of the cycle of regimes. You know, the original word for word revolution meant the revolution of the heavens, coming back to an original place, and that's where we cash in the old government and start a new one.
Even
Okay,
in Indian religions, there's the reincarnation of gods that goes in a cycle.
there we go. It's another cycle. So China, India, Persia, the Med Basin are all cyclical. Even the Aztecs or the Olmecs, the Mesoamerican civilizations, insofar as we understand the calendar, believe that this world's a giant, that time is a giant circle. All right, what Christianity does is introduce the idea of linear time. Actually, it's probably implicit in the Old Testament too, but it's made very explicit in the New Testament with Revelation. History has a beginning, which is Genesis. Now, you don't have to believe that God made the world in 7 days. It just has a beginning. That's all you need. And then it has a middle. Depending on what religious tradition you take, the middle is going to be most likely whatever prophet you think is most important. So for Muslims, it'll be Muhammad and his revelation. For Christians, it'll be Jesus. I suppose that for Jews, it will be Moses. But if you see the idea, it has a beginning, it has a middle, but that means it has an end. Now, you may wonder why this is important. Well, it's hard to explain or to describe what the end of the world would look like. If you like the kind of imagery in Revelation, that's of course fine, but I can't make much sense of it. But I do come away with the sense, right, that they've invented a new way of looking at time, and as a result of a new way of looking at history. Now, fast forward into the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, and what you're going to see is that some important German thinkers are going to pseudo-secularize this overtly religious linear conception of history, which requires a redeemer and redemption. And those thinkers will be Hegel and Marx. And everyone nowadays who believes themselves to be progressive is the heir to that Christian insight, because they're trying to create the end of the world, to abolish evil. If they're not, then there's nothing for progressive politics to progress towards.
If it's circular, then you're just coming back to the same place. It's not progressive.
But yeah, right. In other words, why bother? Why break the sweat?
Yeah.
So we're going to ratchet up and make things permanently better. Well, okay. What this is the New Testament sanded down and varnished with technology and science. You see what I'm saying? In other words, if you don't get this linear conception of time and history, you don't get the idea of progress, and you don't get progressive politics. So one of the problems that I see in contemporary undergraduates is that they've been disappointed by their flawed education, because they don't know who they are and who their actual intellectual antecedents really are.
In other words, their intellectual roots in a certain way.
Well, they have all the branches and none of the roots, right? It's not an accident that both Kant and Hegel describe themselves as being Orthodox Lutherans, and Marx, although he was not a Christian, but a Jew, he took that Christian linear idea of history and then plugged it into economics rather than religion. One of my teachers in graduate school, one of my favorites, used to say, Marxism is the last great Christian heresy. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I like what's good in Christianity. I like compassion for the ill-treated. But don't tell me that you found out about that and decided to approve that by doing some rational activity, because I'm going to call your bluff and ask you, in what sense is it rational to care about people that you don't know that are in pain and ill-treated? And then we'll get bada, 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 and then they'll make reference to some.
Like of it, if you give me a minute. In that,
I'm willing to give my students as much time as they want.
It's more like if you are not going towards in terms of helping others or showing kindness to others, and you're going towards your own views, your own self-fulfillment, and you only see it as internal or just about yourself, then there is really no end to it, and it's very easy to get lost, and it's often not rooted in anything at all. And you can observe two cohorts of people, one who depend on kindness and social presence, and the other ones that are talking about self-fulfillment just for themselves. And you can find that in the longer run, perhaps the cohort with kindness and and compassion survive better and are also much more fulfilled. That could be a review for that.
Okay, all right. No, that's a very clever retort. It's wrong. All right, here's the reason. What you're doing is making an attenuated self-interest argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So either you're going to take the Good Samaritan as it is, or you're just actually a little more clever about your deployment of self-interest.
Yeah. No, that's true.
Right? What Jesus or the Buddha allows us to do is to make reference to a story that we all learned or we probably learned as kids, that doesn't need to put a fig leaf of self-interest over love because it's not embarrassed about it.
Okay, yeah.
All right. You see how I'm deploying this as a language with which to talk about the most important things? I don't care whether Jesus walked on water. I believe in spite of the miracles, not because of them.
Okay.
People that like that kind of stuff are welcome to believe it. Key thing is this, and I'll leave you with this. Religions are languages, and the reason why this upper 10% no longer does it is because they disdain to talk to the other 90%. They'd rather talk to each other. It's hubris once again. And of course, that's what kills Greek heroes.
Yeah.
That's where tragedy comes from. Okay, thank you all. It's been a very enjoyable and interesting chat. I'm afraid that my brain is Swiss cheese. I can't think off the cuff like I used to. My daughter said that I'm about 95% of what I used to be. And this is not like 95% of a loaf of bread where it doesn't make any difference. It's more like 95% of a bridge.
Yeah.
All right, as far as you go, and that's all we got. So I apologize for my inabilities, but I hope that I've forced you to think about some stuff you wouldn't have thought of before, right? And then it's up to you to figure out what you want to do with it. I'm not trying to turn out bad copies of me. I'm trying to make a better version of you. And you do that by first discovering your ignorance and learning the virtue of humility. Remember that in Nicomachean Ethics, humility is not a virtue.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all. I wish that music will lead you to a path that will be good for you and good for everyone else. God bless.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.